So if you make a mistake, obviously humans make mistakes, we all know that. So you want to correct the error if possible. You want to bring it to the appropriate person's attention, whether that's the supervisor, the person you're working with in the lab, the lead, whatever it is for the lab that you're working in, whatever the reporting structure is. And then you want to document errors as, we call them variances. Sometimes people call them occurrences. They have different names, but it's just, we didn't follow what was written in the SOP for whatever reason. So we want to make sure everything is documented with that. So we want to report things again so that we communicate problems with management and to QA to facilitate process improvement, which is really big. Because if there is an issue with a process or a procedure, you're not the only one that's going to have an issue with that. So we want to make sure that it's fixed before we have any more issues. So we want to facilitate training and retraining. So for instance, if I'm a PRN employee and I only come in and work in the laboratory once a month, I may need more training or more retraining than someone who does the processes every day on a weekly basis, who's a full-time employee. So you want to tailor training and continuing education to different employees differently based on the situation, what testing they're doing, how often they're working, that type of thing. And then we have to report issues, biologic product deviations to the FDA within 45 days of discovery. So that doesn't mean 45 days from the day I'm told about the issue. It's 45 days from when someone in the facility should have known it was an issue. So if it gets by a couple of people, that doesn't mean the clock doesn't start till somebody finds it. It started when the first person should have found it. So, and 45 days seems like a while, but it's not that long if you have to investigate what was happening. So you have to know what was the issue, what was the circumstancing surrounding the issue, and then how are we going to prevent the issue in the future. And all of those things have to be reported to the FDA. So we report biologic product deviations, so that's anything if a product was issued. So if it leaves our control, so it leaves the blood center on its way to the hospital, to the transfusion service. That means it's been distributed. So if there was an error with that product, we would report it. If the error is found before it leaves the blood center's hand or before it leaves the transfusion service control, so I'm handing out blood with the nurse, we're going to check it. Oops, there's something wrong with this label, and I find it before I hand it to that person, it's not reportable. If I hand it to that person and then they leave and come back and they're like, oh wait, this label looks funny to me, that's a reportable issue. Something that's a little bit odd, I think, is if there's an error on the floor. The nursing staff or whatever, this very rarely happens because they have lots of checks and balances as well, gives the product to the wrong patient. That is not a reportable issue from the blood bank perspective unless that patient dies. So I do not have to tell the FDA that the nursing staff gave the blood to the wrong patient unless there's a fatality associated with that, because the product is out of the blood bank's control. We didn't have any control over that product when that error occurred. So this is just the code that says you have to report things to the FDA. So it's anything with testing, processing, packing, labeling, storage. So storage temperatures for red cells, 1 to 6 degrees Celsius. You have to document the temperature at least every 4 hours. And I stress the at least. So if I document the temperature because my continuing monitoring system happens to be down for whatever reason, if I document the temperature at 4 hours and 1 minute, that is reportable. Must be at least every 4 hours. If I document the temperature incorrectly, I don't have the negative sign. That has a potential to be reportable. So documentation is very key for these type of things. Labeling, so that includes labeling for samples that you're going to do testing on. So if I get a sample from the floor and it has the patient's middle initial, but I issue a blood product and the label does not have the patient's middle initial, that's reportable, because the testing I did for patient Susie J. Smith does not match the label on the blood, Susie Smith. So we want to make sure that labeling is very important. And that is a very common thing, especially in a big hospital. So the FDA has a guidance document that says, this is how you know when something is reportable. And it includes this flow chart that says, was it out of your control? Yes, keep going. Was it not out of your control? No, I don't have to report it. It doesn't mean it's not a variance, and I don't have to document it internally, but I just don't have to document it and send it to the FDA. So the things for biologic product deviations generally fall into some broad categories. So donor suitability, so post-donation information. The donor comes, they donate. A year later, they come back and they're like, oh yeah, I did go to Mexico. I was in the military and was in England in 1987 or whatever it was. And they didn't remember at the first time they donated, and they give you the information after the fact. There's nothing that you could have done to prevent that error, but it's still an error that gets reported to the FDA. And you have to look back at all the products that was donated from that donor before, issue any recalls that you need to issue, and then report all those. So what happened to that product? Was it transfused? Are you going to notify the person's physician who got that product? So you have to make sure you have all that information. Donor screening, donor deferrals. So if the donor should have been deferred and they were not, and you collect them and distribute that product. If they were deferred at another blood center and you find that out after the fact and you had collected a product and issued it, then those are reportable. The collection process, if there's any issue with possible contamination, sterility, anything like that. Component preparation, so when I'm making the products, if there were anything going on with that. There are clot in the whole blood product and I failed to quarantine the FFP and I let it go out, that would be an issue. Labeling is an issue. So labeling includes any tie tag, cross-match tag that's added to a unit at the transfusion service, not just the label that's on the face of the product that says it's this number, red cell, type O. So it's anything you add to that as well. Any testing, routine testing or viral testing. So if our procedure says that we're going to do 2 ABO types on a patient before we issue plasma, and we don't do 2 types or it's a minute after the fact, so I issue the product at 10, the second type goes in at 10:01, that's a biologic product deviation because our procedure said we would have 2 types on file before we issue products. Quality control and distribution, so anything with instruments, if we don't have the order, is there some issue on the order? They marked a red cell and a platelet, but we only issued a red cell. How do we know that was the product they wanted? Unless we documented something at the time of issue, those type of things. And then they also have some miscellaneous codes. It's always best to report the issue to the FDA and have them say, you didn't really need to report this, than to not report it and then have the field investigator during your inspection say, why didn't you report that? What's going on? It's always better to necessarily over-report than to, if you have a question, not report something. So what's included? We kind of talked about this a little bit, but donor records are incomplete or missing. So if I distribute a product and then I find out that I can't find that donor card anymore, I need to let the FDA know about that. If patient restrictions or MD orders aren't followed, so say you get an order that says this patient has to have irradiated blood, but you issue non-irradiated blood, and there's no documentation of why you did that, then that's reportable. Even if it comes back in the investigation that says, whoops, I ordered that in error. This patient does not need irradiated blood. The patient doesn't need CMV negative blood. The doctor ordered it in error. You still didn't follow the written order, so it's reportable. You can include that in your investigation, but you still have to submit the report. So products, this is some more examples. If the specimen isn't correctly labeled, if you didn't follow the testing procedure, so we say you're supposed to do the screen and incubate it for 10 minutes or whatever it is, and you were in, this is a trauma, so you only incubated it for 7 minutes, something weird like that, that would be reportable. So we want to make sure that we're always following the procedure. So information that's included is the date of the error, the date it was discovered, the code. The FDA has a bunch of codes that fit any given situation, so you have to pick the numeric code that fits so that it can be reported into their system. The description of what happened, any root causes, so we think this happened because whatever situation was going on. And then any corrective actions that we're gonna do, and then any units and their final disposition. So this unit was transfused, and yes, I told the physician about it. This unit was sent for further manufacturing as a plasma product. So no, I'm not gonna tell the manufacturer because they're only gonna make non-injectable products. So you have to say what happened to the product, who you notified, and why or why not. And then what's not included is donor patient information. Will say he, she, the donor, failed to mention that he had been in the military, just basic he, she information. We don't go into long narratives like this was this big story and then this happened and this happened and this happened. We try and cut it down to exactly very short and succinct information for them. Take out any emotion. Sometimes people are really upset by an issue, or they feel really bad that they have a variance and now it's reportable and all this. We don't want any emotion. It's just very dry writing, just like an SOP probably. No opinion. So I write all the deviations, so I can't say, oh man, this transfusion service is out of control. You know, I just don't agree with this at all. You don't want any of that. It's just the facts, as simple as you can make them. And then fatalities are not reported this way. So if you have a fatality or something that may be a transfusion-related fatality, they're reported a different way. You have to call the FDA 24 hours and say, hey, we have this reaction. It's possibly a trolley. The patient died. We're still doing the investigation. This is what's going on. So you call them at 24 hours, and then you have to submit what's called a 7-day report within 7 days that has all the information that you have at that time. So this is what was happening with the patient. This is what, or the donor. It could be a donor if you have a donor fatality, which I luckily have never experienced. But what was going on, and then any information you don't have, when you think you're going to have it, and then you provide those as follow-ups for fatality.